Hello and welcome everyone to 10th Period, the Bill of Rights Institute webinar series. My name is Kirk Higgins. I'm the Senior Manager of Education at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I am joined by my two colleagues, Gary and Rachel.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, thanks for having us.
This is so fun.
And we are coming to you live, really live today. And we're hoping to have a casual conversation about education and sort of the nature of education and what we've been thinking about, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, because it's caused all of us to kind of take a step back and really reflect on what it is that we're doing as educators and the work that we're doing to educate and what all of that means. And it's something we've been talking about internally. And so we thought it would be great if we just brought that conversation out to the open and had it with you all. And so with that, Gary and Rachel, I'll kind of kick things off by thinking about a couple words. So etymology is always really interesting to me. And I think particularly in education, words are really a way of opening up a door. For me, like I remember it was a moment in my educational journey that like when I realized that words weren't just things that I was having to fill out onto a paper to reach the number of pages I needed to finish an assignment, but were actually really powerful, was eye-opening for me. And so as I was getting ready for this conversation, I was thinking about the word college, because although we mainly work in the high school space, in a sense, high schools are colleges to a certain extent. And that word college is one that's really interesting to me because it comes from the Latin root, which means partnership or all together. And so there's a sense that this educational journey that we're on is in fact a partnership with our students and with our fellow colleagues, and that together we are working towards an end of becoming more educated. But it's not just something we're dictating to our students. Everybody in that partnership has a role and we're all participating in it. So I thought I'd start it there and just get everyone's thoughts, and then we can see where the conversation takes us.
Yeah, can I jump in first with that? I think your word or college and partnership is a really good starting point, because I think what we're facing right now is that concept of what it means to be together, because there's physical together, which is very obvious, but then there's like this conceptual togetherness that I think we're working through. So that partnership idea, that back and forth is now a time to revisit that what does that mean? And I like that you started with analyzing a word, because I guess I've been thinking about that for this conversation as well, the word essential. It's a word that's coming up a lot during this period, and often referred to in terms of business or parts of society that are essential. But I think of it for two reasons. One, what the nature of the word is itself. And I'm excited to talk about this because we do love philosophical things. And so I think of my Aristotle and other things in terms of, so there's what is the essence of a thing? It is sort of an immutable concept. It's a conceptual thing. And it's a really interesting thing to think about because it allows for so much variation, right? So and I'm just going to toss it out there. We haven't discussed this ahead of time, but if you were to toss out the idea of oranges, bananas, apples, essentially they are fruit, right? We kind of categorize there's something to them. And so getting down to what connects these things together, which I think brings to the other point, which is school hasn't actually ended right now, right? Education has not stopped. It continues, even though the coming together has been on pause. What is essential to education? Is that happening? And if so, like, what does that mean? What does that look like? And I guess the essential parts that I think about are, that education happens, what that is contained in that, what is the content of that education, and then how it occurs. So I think in this conversation, it's interesting having fewer answers and more questions, but that's good in a way.
Right. And what I really appreciate about what's happening right now is there's this idea in economics called demonstrated preference, that what you do shows what your highest order preference is. because that's what you're choosing with your scarce resources and time to do. We are demonstrating preferences about what we think is essential in education. And I think one of the things that is coming out of this crisis is, yes, as you said, Gary, education, we still haven't defined that word yet, is essential, because no one's thought was that you would just stop all educational activity the same way that you stopped all barbershop activity, right? So barbershop activity at some point was just, no one is doing that anymore. It was never a concept in communities that you would stop all educational activity. There would be some sort of educational activity continuing. So it is essential for us societally in that way. But what aspects of it are essential? It has become a really interesting conversation, and varying widely throughout culture and community in the States, and different school districts, different schools within different school districts are interpreting the essential aspects of the education differently.
Exactly. Yeah. The idea of coming together. I mean, there's a lot of asynchronous work that's happening, but that still takes some kind of preparation, some kind of topics. But there's also a drive to have some synchronousness together, to have people, even if you're not physically communicating. Many schools are saying, but we need to have some time where people are communicating in real time with each other, or not. How often that is, what is talked about, how do you prep, attendance. Do you have to be there or not? Grading, don't even want to start with that unless we want to, but that is an excellent point. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and we really welcome all of your comments as well. So if you want to send us comments down in the chat box, we're happy to try and answer as many of those questions as we can. But it makes me think about what it is that we're doing as sort of a humane study. So we talk about the humanities, and I know that you all have heard me talk about this before, but C.S. Lewis had a really great speech on the eve of the beginning of the Second World War, and what he was grappling with was, look, there's a horrific event that is occurring, but that doesn't mean that this essential work of trying to understand human beings better stops. And to a certain extent, education is a path for us to all become more aware of our fellows, more aware of our society, more aware of what it means to be ourselves. And that work is critically important and doesn't stop being important just because there are things going on that distract us from it. And in a certain sense, it becomes more important in that instance, because the thing that we are preserving is that humanity that we all have. And that's a really powerful thing. And to lose sight of that and to move away from trying to better understand what that means is turning to a sort of a darker age where we're not having this time that we're setting aside to really think about our own nature in the world and our place in it. So that's super meta.
Well, I think that's what we're seeing, right? So there were some districts who prioritized the hard sciences in the transition, right? They focused first on rolling out what math would look like and what science would look like, and they left English and social studies second in that prioritization. And I think that that's a really interesting question. Math and science, there is a corpus that's very clear, and that corpus is actually pretty self-explanatory in terms of laying itself out in the systems that exist, in the textbooks that exist. There, of course, I was a math and science teacher as well for part of my career, so obviously teachers and nuance are necessary to help students with the nuance of the concepts within the maths and the sciences. But I think there is a difference between the role of a community in the humanities in interpretive work, right? And so the time of collaboration and kind of coming together for understanding is that much more vital in an ambiguous philosophical kind of engagement, right? And so I'm wondering, the title of this webinar is like, what is social studies for in a crisis? Or what is education in the humanities for in a crisis? And I think that C.S. Lewis piece is very powerful, and we'll get you the link to that in the comments or in the description. But it was so powerful because he was saying that it is in many ways more essential in times of crisis, because it gives you a lens through which to interpret the current situation.
No, exactly. It's the coming together, not only through distance, but also over time. I think it's significant that in putting together our discussions, often we reach to people that we've not met through the books we read, right? Through not only living people, but also people of the past. As I was reading through, trying to dig into what I think is an interesting essence of education, I think it's very similar to that. I found a quote by Anthony O'Hear, who is a philosopher of education, and his conclusion, I thought was a really interesting one, that the essence is, that I'm quoting from him here, to introduce the young to what elders believe is the best that has been done in the various forms of knowledge and experience that have been developed. And I think that's a really interesting sort of open approach to what you're saying, that the history of education, there have been a lot of changes that have occurred. And so we, rather than learning fresh, we're not starting fresh every generation. The idea is that you're passing things down. And that's what social studies is really about. So is math, obviously, in a way, but the true stories and learnings of just the human experience being passed down is really fascinating.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it's important to be able to say as well, look, they're both equally important and they have different functions.
Right.
And social studies doesn't have the same result that a lesson in mathematics does necessarily, but that doesn't mean it's lesser, or it doesn't mean it's not as important. It's a different subject focusing on a different topic. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me about education is that to a certain extent, education requires discipline, right? I mean, education is work. It's something that doesn't just come to you, and you don't sit down with a book and suddenly you know things. You have to work at it. You have to really dedicate yourself to the process of learning, much to the chagrin of all of us. I wish I could just sleep with books under my pillow.
Right. Just matrix it.
Yeah, but maybe I don't, because there is something about that that process that is rewarding. And all of us who sort of work in education know that us working with students to achieve that end is rewarding. And I think this has been an opportunity for us to reflect on that discipline as we're all having to focus and do this. I don't know. And I saw that we have a couple comments coming in, and Christina mentioned thinking about what it means to be a part of a community in the self versus a group, right? And I think that's a really powerful thing that social studies really does help you grapple with. When and why do you sacrifice on behalf of others, right? If we're all sort of acting in our own sphere, we're all really worried about what's happening in our own homes, and we're concerned about our own families. How is it that we then make the decision to know that our community needs us to sacrifice on their behalf?
At the very root, root of the history of schooling is this idea of the civic mission of schools, that you have a duty to your, like a community has a duty to its young people to provide opportunities, to give them resources to then enter into the society.
Right.
So how are we doing that right now is a really interesting question.
Yeah. And I think to the purpose of all of this, I mean, I keep talking about Plato, but even at the development of our education system is this really interesting balance of, again, is the purpose to develop like your internal conditions or to have an impact on your environment? And the answer is probably both, obviously, but like what that means, even, and again, not just social studies learning everything, but social studies in particular, that has a change. Is the purpose of this changing the individuals or having those individuals change the outside world, or obviously it's in both? What does that look like now? And I think that's right. And I think Krista's point about that is community and personal experience, that continues no matter what.
Right. And so the question becomes, again, like, what should is a terrible word, and should is actually is a violent word. It has judgments attached to it.
It assumes an alternate, yeah.
It assumes an alternate. So I'm like, should, but the question is, what is the value that we have? What are we valuing right now, so that our actions in our space with our students will reflect those values? That's kind of the question. It's a better question than what should we be teaching, right?
Yeah, no.
What are the values that we are demonstrating with our students right now?
Right.
And how will that influence their own understanding of the nature and importance of their education?
Right.
Because and we've been saying this, like Maslow over Bloom, right? Like there's this idea that you have a lot of students who are in desperate conditions, whose families are in desperate situations, and it's only going to get worse in the coming months and the coming weeks as the trickle effect of this, the economic impact of what's happening continues, as the educational effect continues, as you see universities and colleges be impacted and school boards, school district budgets be impacted. So the question is, how do we help them understand the importance of their educational experience right now? Go ahead, Gary. Sorry to cut you off.
No, I was going to say exactly right. That's again raising a question beyond having an answer. But part of it, and look, we're always living through time, right? But we're using the word crisis, and I think that's true, that it is unusual to feel history happening every day around you. You may hear of it. It may have been something that occurred that we referred to, but for a history teacher right now, it's really happening. And I noticed a comment from Hollis, who said it's an opportunity for our students to create primary sources instead of using others to learn from. I mean, that's exactly true. I mean, right now, the act of being a historian as you are studying history is an interesting way of looking at that question that you just had.
Yeah, and I think that's what all these comments are. Owl Girl, Jacqueline, Laura, how are we helping our students? I mean, there's just so many opportunities to connect what's happening right now to periods in the past. There are so many parallels that help them kind of ease that tension between the now and the next moment by saying there are models that we can draw from, right? There is experience, and it wasn't maybe our experience, but there is cultural experience that we can draw from. There's historical perspective that we can draw from. And that has a really salutary effect, right? Adolescents are used to feeling alone. They're used to feeling like they're the only ones that experience things. It's part of their modality. Anybody who works with adolescents know, like, it's really important that I'm the only one that has ever experienced this thing in the history of ever. And that's part of their psychological formation. And at the same time, when they are put in contact with either books or ideas or other people who have had similar experiences, there's this huge sense of relief and kind of in their interpretive ability.
Right. And it gets to that, again, question of essential, and that the details of the experience of another may be different, and yet there's what is it that makes that connection of a common experience? I mean, it's not 1918 right now, and yet there is a common experience that can be touched upon that a student immediately can connect to. Right. And for what end or what purposes? It's interesting.
Yeah, I really like the phrase "history rhymes." I'm not as big of a fan of history repeats itself, which we can dive into if we really want to, but I do think history rhymes because I think there's something about the commonality, and I saw somebody mention enduring issues, right? There's something about the commonality of the human experience that's shaped by the context that you're in, but that is common across time, particularly when we live in a similar, governing and societal structure as others. So that is, looking at U.S. history has a different context for us than does French history, because we have a connection to it, right? And looking at history from that perspective, particularly as you're living through this kind of moment, raises a lot of interesting themes that can really be dived into. One of those that we have been diving into, and I saw somebody mentioned tension between the public good and and personal good, I think is an interesting one. We've been talking about debates over civil liberties, right? And it's an interesting time to highlight those kinds of conversations because you're looking at it with real pressures around you. And it's to say, look, these are very hard things to balance, and they're very difficult things to get right, especially when right now we will never know less than we do right now. I mean, as this debate goes on, as time moves forward, we're going to be able to look back and have a lot more hindsight. But right now, none of us really know how this is going to end for certain. We may have ideas about it, we may have other things, but thinking about what it is we're valuing, what it is we're seeing as essential, and where it is that we think safeguards need to be minded or compromised on, I think it's just a really valuable lesson because it shows you the real life deliberation that has to occur among citizens for a society like ours to function.
Mm-hmm. And I love this coming in from Robert, that his students are thinking more deeply about social and economic aspects of life. You know, when life is easy, it's easy to not be critical, to not be philosophical. Right. And I think we mentioned this in our prep call, that like the reason the Stoics developed their philosophy was because there's a lot of hardship in life, right? And you need a framework to manage that hardship and maintain resiliency, right? And so what a lot of the historical content gives us are frameworks to manage the hardship and to understand it so we can process it and make decisions. And that's going all the way back to all positions of power, but especially in democratic societies, where you have a duty to be well informed, because bad times will come and you are responsible for the outcomes that will occur because you are part of the process. It's not kings on high making decisions that will affect you, but you are part of the democratic self-governance, in that not only do you have agency in making choices about what you follow and what you don't follow of the laws, but also that you have agency in the decision in crafting who becomes a decision maker. And so I think that there's this, again, this duty that we have, but the only way we can exercise that duty is if we're well informed. And the only way we get well informed is if we value a kind of social studies, history, education.
Yeah, and duty has sort of this heavy responsibility thing to it, which, you know, I don't necessarily think it does, because I was thinking about another word, and Gary had mentioned some Greek thinkers, so I'll mention Aristotle. I forget if you mentioned him or not, but when I think about the word habit, because, you know, habits are something that we're all having to form right now, because our lived experience is very different than it was 3 months ago, right? So I'm now working from home. That's required me to develop new habits. But education, and I think this was part of Aristotle's point about, you know, the formation of the individual. You're forming deliberate habits around education too. And so thinking about, and I saw Jeffrey mention his students thinking about dreams and where they can go and what they can shape their lives in. You know, that is a deliberate action that's requiring sort of a vision and building out a framework that's going to help you achieve that. I think thinking deliberately about habits and as Aristotle would refer to them, virtues to a certain extent. In virtues, we, you know, have a very particular definition of, but meaning that we're working on those things which are helping us to achieve the ends that we wish to make, right? And surfacing those things can be really interesting too, I think, because, you know, it's not just, again, thinking about education, it's not just something we all come by. You know, you've got to deliberately turn yourself toward it and be disciplined and focused at learning about it. Even, you know, someone as brilliant, I almost said Elon Musk, but that's probably not a great example of this, but call it Albert Einstein. Yeah, call Albert Einstein, right? You know, Einstein is brilliant, but he had to learn, and learning took deliberate action and focus. And I think those are things we can be thinking about now too, is that habit formation.
And deliberation. Yeah. I think that so go ahead, Gary. We can.
No, what was the word you were saying?
Deliberation. So again, I think about the kind of, and I don't want to call it an opportunity, because I would never wish this situation on anyone in the world, right? Like, but I think that there's a way to, and it is the human spirit of resiliency and the psychology of resiliency says that we'll get through this if we believe we will, right? Like there needs to be that kind of optimism that there will be an end to this, and on the other end we will be able to come back, and we will have the creativity and the energy and the entrepreneurial spirit to bring ourselves into a new and better future on the other side. And that resiliency that requires a deliberative faculty, the ability to take what's happening now, analyze it, make decisions that will better inform your future activity. And so again, I think that there's so much in the historical context and in the historical record that helps with that deliberation, that faculty of deliberation that will eventually allow us to reach continued states of flourishing in the future.
Absolutely. And I think, and I think you're saying exactly what I was thinking of in terms of that deliberation, historically, getting back to the essence of education happening, has been very organic. It's not like there was a plan that was just launched and it's been running and now there's a hiccup and we're waiting to get back to that. Education has not stopped a day since then. Things got in the way. There might have been a Saturday maybe where we all, just said, that's enough, I'm just going to go to the hammock. But I mean, for the most part, the school of 2020 wasn't the school of 15 years ago, wasn't the school of 50 years ago, wasn't the school of 100 years ago. School itself, that concept, and yet the education has. And so there's something enduring about all of that, that deliberation to say, yeah, things have always been changing.
Right.
And so it's okay to say, speculate, what does it look like? Now is time for a weird reboot of our thinking of the things that have to be part of education and things that do not have to be part of education. I mean, does it have an end in mind, or is it the habits, or some combination of both?
Right.
How it's measured.
What is the use and importance of measurement?
Right. That's exactly.
Right. So I mean, there are a lot of districts, schools, states who are rethinking what measurement means in this time, right? Rethinking what content is essential and what content is not essential given the context of what's happening. And will that have continuous effects? Will we go back into the classroom? Will you, teachers, go back into your classrooms and teach the same way you taught 6 months ago, 6 months from now, barring any change in the physical space? So even if everyone went back physically in the building in September, would you teach the same way? What would change for you?
Right.
What has this done to your understanding of your practice, of your own goals, of your own values in your own teaching career?
Yeah, a major question I have is not only how teaching's changing, but also how does student demonstration of learning changing, right? How are they in some way demonstrating that they understand something differently than they were demonstrating before, just because that was the way it had been done? Is their demonstration of understanding, or what I'm finding really fascinating is their curiosity. They're at home. A lot of the kids, they're logging in, right? They are still interested. They are even somehow more interested in a lot of ways.
Right.
And so you're right. What of that will be altered 6 months from now?
Right. Again, if constraints aside,
right.
That's another thing. I mean, I think that one of the barriers to learning right now is the uncertainty, right? So in order to have the space in our minds to do the hard work of learning, because it is hard work, there needs to be some sense of consistency in expectation. One of the things we're dealing with, all of us as human beings on the earth right now, is that our expectations are, it's unclear what the future holds for the next 6 months to a year to 2 years. And that's never happened in our lifetimes. And that certainly never happened in the lifetimes of 15-year-olds. And so I think that what we're helping our students work with, again, reflecting back on history, is that times of uncertainty create opportunities for this kind of reset that Gary was mentioning. That because we don't know exactly what it's going to be, we can start to imagine alternates and options. And you're seeing a lot of those kind of come out in the news. Like there are 20 different options for universities right now that they're all playing with. School districts are starting to talk about what the potential future will hold. But then there's also potential futures for society. There are potential futures for them that maybe didn't exist. Gap years for graduating seniors. They're not, maybe that's something that will fundamentally change in American culture. Maybe everyone's going to take a gap year like they do in Europe and Australia.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think it underlines the uncertainty that we all live with, but that we don't always see. And I mean that because we've lived at society broadly has been fairly stable for quite some time, and that's not always the case. But I think that the importance of education becomes much more accentuated when you realize that we're all building generation by generation the world in which we live. Mm-hmm. And when that thing seems so continuous, the real importance of the work that you educators are working on can sometimes, the relevance can seem a little bit further away. And I think right now we're at a moment, because that uncertainty is so immediate for us, we're really seeing the importance that comes from understanding ourselves, understanding our society, understanding mathematics and science, but understanding all of these things and why it is that we have to understand how it is that we relate to one another, right? And I think studying government comes under that. Understanding government requires studying history. Understanding history requires studying human beings. I mean, they all relate to each other in this really beautiful, impactful way. I guess I'm thinking of all this because I'm thinking of the quote from the Federalist, but what is government but the greatest reflection upon all human nature? And that's what it is. And I think we're all having a moment now where we're reflecting on what that means and what we need to study and learn and teach in order to ensure that we're continuing to focus and think about those things.
Right. And as you said before, it's even on top of that, there's the content. And again, I actually thought I was going to get a lot more reading done than I've been getting lately. But I'm finding there is still that power of trying to come together. I mean, I see April has mentioned something about what we value and valuing social emotional learning, and others talking about community. I mean, we chose right now to talk about it. And now we're joined by people right now who are writing into us and watching and keep writing in because we do love the exchange. But that's an interesting part of it, right? We didn't just publish something historical, put it out there, right? Which we could do. That's great. And we do that, filled with books. But there's also about the coming together, right? And how education, there's something about that non-in-a-bookness, that's a terrible word, community to education as being also somewhat essential, even if it's not physically together.
Well, and most educational theorists and educational psychologists will tell you that education is a social activity, right? So at its root, at its core, education is learning from others around you how to be. And it's how to be and how to be in a multitude of ways, but learning from others around you. And I think that also, so that's what Jacqueline is speaking to, that there's this idea that there's the humanistic impulse within education is being highlighted right now. There was a bit culturally of distraction when it came to the connective part of education, and all the memes I see on all the teacher Facebook groups I'm a part of are how much we miss our students,
right?
How much teachers miss the community of their students. How much the teachers miss the community of fellow teachers.
Right.
And I think that that's true kind of writ large among society as we do our physical distancing, but it's even more true, especially for younger learners, but adolescents and high school teachers, because there's something so essential about the community that's created in the pursuit of knowledge. And and how we continue to value that, I think this is highlighting the continued value in that community in the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a few comments here speaking to, social and emotional learning. And I think that speaks directly to what you're talking about too, Rachel, which is how is it that we can connect with one another? How is it we can support one another? How is it that we can all work towards the well-being of ourselves and of society writ large, right? And that doesn't necessitate the memorization of facts or learning about this, that, or the other thing. It can mean just investigating ourselves and what we're feeling and how we can speak about those things, and how it is that we see the world communicating those things to us too, right? I mean, that's where literature can be a really powerful tool in that, because it's exploration of a lot of those kinds of themes in a way that you don't find in other avenues. And that's what I think is really beautiful about all of these different disciplines, is that they all highlight different facets of what it means to be a human being, and highlights just how complicated of creatures we really are.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, if we're focusing on, go ahead.
I want to do a quick plug for those of you that don't know. We've been running a webinar series for students called Bright and Early, where we actually speak to them about a lot of these issues about creativity and our place in time right now, and give them activities that they can do and little bits of historical context. So if you go to our YouTube channel, you can find all of our Bright and Early episodes. We put them out weekly, and those are student facing. So kind of similar to what we're doing here, just not quite as philosophical. And we'd love to have your students join us, or you join us for those conversations as well. What were you saying?
No, exactly. Those opportunities. I mean, I guess I'm thinking of it because we started off that way, but just like the power of the words and word choices, and super biased because that's what my teaching background, but just even thinking social studies, right? Like that, what does that ultimately mean? Sure, history is absolutely part of that, right? Because most people have existed prior to this. But thinking a lot about what are the essential parts of social studies in this time. Have we come to any kind of conclusions? Where are we at right now?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, I don't know, but I did look up the meaning of the word studies, because social seemed kind of like, yeah, I get social, but what does studies really mean? And the definition I found was achieved or maintained by careful and deliberate effort.
Oh,
which I think is interesting. And social studies, they just said the study of human society, which seems kind of bland, but it's true. And it is, I think, to a certain extent. But I also think getting behind those words, you really start to see how rich that becomes. But I don't know if that's a conclusion or not, Gary. I think
not that I'm trying to get to. It's just we've had so many key ideas so far, right? About like our question was, what is the purpose of education, the social studies education in a crisis? And I think every part of that question is interesting. There's the in the crisis context. There's the social studies itself. There is what is education, and so just considering all that's such a rich question to ask. That when you were mentioning Bright and Early and other things and other ways of staying in touch, I'm also thinking we're coming together right now, but I don't want that to be the end of the conversation. How do we continue that afterward?
Yeah, and I think, our YouTube channel is here. So please always, whenever we have live events, join us. We love to talk to you. But I think that this is obviously an ongoing conversation. And organizationally, the Bill of Rights Institute is a teacher-centered organization. We don't exist without our teachers. Our teachers are the heart and lifeblood of everything we do. So we are here to serve you wherever you are in your teaching journey as an educator of whatever kind of educator you are. So this conversation continues, right? We are nowhere near through this crisis, and we are nowhere near the end of history. So I think well, maybe those two things will come. I don't want to. But I think that we have an opportunity to continue. What this has done and is given us the space to ask this question, right? I mean, we don't have a lot of extra time. I think I saw a statistic that most people are working about 2 to 3 extra hours a day.
Right.
They're in their days, in the remote work world that we're in right now. So it's not like we have extra time. But there's a difference in the kind of time we have, right? A lot of our extracurriculars are no more. A lot of your students' extracurriculars are no more. And that gives us these moments of reflection that we have the opportunity to explore. And I don't know that a year ago, when we came up with topics for our webinar, we would have asked this question.
No,
I don't think
right.
we would have, right? And so that's an opportunity for us to continue to ask these kinds of questions. And this question is not going anywhere for the next couple of years. And so there is going to be the continual refinement of what our work means right now in this context and how we can better support one another.
Yeah, and I'll just say over the next 4 weeks, so we have 2 10th period webinars left before we sort of wrap up our semester. And we're going to continue to explore this topic from a couple different angles, but we do hope that you'll continue to stay tuned, but also reach out to us via Facebook or on YouTube or email us, and we're happy to continue this conversation or to provide you with content that you may need. So if there's anything that you're trying to discuss with your students or there's any resources that we can provide to you, let us know, and we'll do whatever we can to support you in whatever way you need. So
yeah, I think that's a core idea that even I've gained from this conversation is education. One of the, not answers, but one of the things discoveries is it doesn't stop. It's not stopping for us. It's not stopping for you all. It's not stopping for anybody. It may look different, but it just keeps going. And I think that's literally true. And that's really interesting.
Be human. It's part of what it means to be a human, is to learn and grow and continue on our way, and together. So one of my favorite quotes is, education is an act of optimism, that we do what we do because we think it's going to improve the future. And we have again, that word duty, but that word duty is very warming to me, but we have a duty as educators to keep optimistic and to help our students see the future as something that they can be a part of in a positive way. So we're so grateful to everything that you do out there in the trenches with your students, in all the variety of ways that you're engaging with them right now. And we are here for you however you need us to be. So thank you.
Absolutely. So thank you all so much for joining us. We really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for all the comments, and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation with you. So thanks so much.
All right, thanks.